Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's video is inspired by the work of Kurt Luther, the founder of Civil War Photo Sleuth, a free app that uses face recognition technology and traditional crowdsourcing techniques to identify unknown Civil War soldier photographs. Before Kurt created Photo Sleuth, and I should say, with all transparency, I'm also involved in the project. He wrote a column for Military Images magazine, and Kurt still does. In his most recent column, Kurt describes how he solved the mystery of the Union officer pictured here. He was partially identified only as W.H. Hamner, first lieutenant and signal officer. Now, thanks to Kurt's detective work, we know that he is William Henry Hamner, life dates 1838 to 1925, a native of Virginia who remained loyal to the Union. He spent much of the Civil War as a lieutenant and captain with the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, which is how he is pictured here. But before Hamner joined the 3rd Rhode Island, he was in the regular army, serving as the regimental quartermaster sergeant for the 1st U.S. Light Artillery, which happened to be stationed at Fort Moultrie. Kurt notes that Hamner accompanied the garrison of Fort Moultrie when they moved to Fort Sumter. This is early 1861, and Hamner was actually the man who lowered the Stars and Stripes on April 14th, 1861, after Major Robert Anderson negotiated the evacuation of the garrison, that negotiation, of course, taking place with South Carolina forces. Moreover, the story continues. 4 years later, after the ruins of Fort Sumter were back in Union possession, Hamner numbered among the party who restored the original flag that he himself had taken down. I became a little bit curious, more curious, to know about Hamner's role after reading Kurt's biographical information. So I went out to see what else I could find. And I imagined he lived until 1925. The 50th anniversary of the Civil War was celebrated during his lifetime. He certainly had an interesting role being part of Fort Sumter in April 1861. And I had hoped that someone had written something more about him. And I was very happy to find exactly what I was hoping for. Hamner's story, in his own words, they appear in the April 13th, 1910 issue of the Los Angeles Times. He had moved to California after the war, and he spoke with an interview. I want to read the words of the interview to you. But before I begin, I want you to listen for him talking about how him being a Virginian played into the larger narrative, or how he thought it played into the larger narrative at the time. Also, listen for his note about the cannon salute that ended in an accidental death, which is well known to you students of the Civil War. So, here we go from the Los Angeles Times. There is no dispute that the flag was lowered by Lieutenant Colonel W.H. Hamner. I should mention, Hamner stayed in the Army after the war and rose to that rank, also serving in the Spanish-American War. But let me continue. Lieutenant Colonel W.H. Hamner, now a resident of this city. Yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the attack on Fort Sumter, and Lieutenant Colonel Hamner celebrated it at the Ingram Hotel playing billiards with a hand almost as steady and eyes almost as keen as on that historic day when the first Confederate shot flew over the fort. Lieutenant Colonel Hamner's memory of those early days is remarkably clear, and yesterday, as his thoughts turned back, he declared that it is wonderful how distinct the incidents connected with the attack stand out in his mind. Quote, this is Hamner's words, "I was a regimental quartermaster sergeant, 1st Artillery," he said, "and with 2 companies of artillery, went over to Fort Sumter on the night of December 26th, 1860, from Fort Moultrie, which was about 1,300 yards from Sumter. Major Anderson was in command. Sumter was less accessible to attack from Moultrie, the Hatter being on the land. When we entered Sumter, the Confederates construed it as an overt act and immediately began the erection of batteries and enfilading Sumter. They had heard of the relief which President Lincoln was sending to us and made a formal demand on Major Anderson for the surrender of the fort. As I have been informed, continued Lieutenant Colonel Hamner, Anderson sent back word by the emissaries of the Confederacy that his provisions were to be exhausted at a certain time when he would then be compelled to evacuate the fort. But as he did not accede to their demands, a message was sent to him between 2 and 3 o'clock on the morning of April 12th that they would open fire on the works within an hour's time. And they did, declared Lieutenant Colonel Hamner. The first shot was construed as a signal to begin the attack and was fired from a mortar on Johnson's Island. Afterwards, the firing of the shot was conceded to ex-Governor Ruffin, that's Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, from the ironclad battery on Morris's Island. The Confederates commenced about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we did not reply until about 7 o'clock, or until it was light enough for our shots to take effect. Another reason for the delay was because our ammunition was rather limited. We had only a limited supply of cartridge bags. These bags were filled with powder for the guns, and during the fight, we had to set men to sewing up the bags in order to keep up the firing. Our command was divided into 3 reliefs, 2 hours on and 4 hours off. As the fight progressed on the 12th, we were reduced to 1 hardtack and coffee for each man, and when this was consumed, we were without food until the 14th, when we evacuated and boarded the transport Baltic. On the 13th, the barracks caught fire and burned, and during this time, ex-Senator Wigfall of Texas came over to the forts with a demand for our surrender. When Wigfall came, there was a cessation of hostilities. Major Anderson knew that he could not hold out as the provisions were exhausted. He was offered his own terms to evacuate. About noon, after 1.5 days hard fighting, arrangements were made that we should evacuate on the 14th. It was intended to fire a salute of 100 guns to the flag by our own forces, but there was an accident during the salute somewhere about the 26th gun, in which 1 man was killed outright and the whole gun detachment wounded, and the salute ceased. I was stationed at the flag with instructions to lower it at the conclusion of the salute, which I did, but being a Virginian, I felt that they were rubbing it into me. My pride was hurt. It was an outrage, and I haven't gotten over it yet. He added, I felt humiliated. I had been offered before Lincoln's election by the son of the mayor of Charleston a position in the Confederacy if I would leave the Union service and join them. It was their intention to secede in case Mr. Lincoln was elected. This was in July of 1860 that they were planning secession. Floyd, the Secretary of War, was sending arms to the Charleston arsenal. I declined the offer. I said I was with the Union forces and I was going to stay with them. My term for service would have expired February 6th, but I re-enlisted for 5 years the day that South Carolina seceded. I want to clear up one point that is misunderstood. We never surrendered Fort Sumter. Anderson was permitted to evacuate on his own terms, and we went out, starving men, but carrying our colors and the band playing Yankee Doodle. Surrender? Never. We boarded the Isabella, a Confederate steamer, and stayed overnight, and on the morning of the 15th, she steamed over the bar and put us aboard the Baltic, which was bringing us supplies. Lieutenant Colonel Hamner also figured in raising the Union flag over the ruins of Fort Sumter. President Lincoln commissioned Anderson, then Brigadier General, to perform his duty. That, of course, was in 1865, April 14th, 1865. Hamner begged permission to raise the flag to wipe out the humiliation of having lowered it, but Anderson did not give him the permission. Hamner stood on the platform among the spectators and heard Henry Ward Beecher, the famous minister, make the oration. He relates with pride that he was a member of a storming party, and I'm going to suspend my reading for just a moment to tell you this last bit of interview here. He talks about being part of a storming party in November of 1864, just a few months before Fort Sumter fell to Union forces. And Hamner was part of a party that tried to storm and failed to land on Fort Sumter. So here's what he says. He relates with pride that he, Hamner, was a member of the storming party that attempted to capture Fort Sumter. But to this day, he shudders at the recollection of his narrow escape from death. Again, this is November of 1864. A bullet fired by a Confederate on the fort clipped a lock of hair from his left temple and killed a Union soldier almost at his feet. Hamner had made a midnight sortie in a boat, desperately striving to use a howitzer in the bow. When he recalls the incident and closes his eyes, he can hear the shrill scream of the bullet as it sped on its deadly mission. So there you have the story of Hamner, then Quartermaster Sergeant William Hamner at Fort Sumter in 1861. Before we go, I want to leave you with one very short anecdote, and this comes from the regiment's history, and it's told by one of the comrades who served with Hamner. This anecdote gives a little bit of an insight to Hamner's personality, and the anecdote is set at the Battle of Honey Hill, which is in South Carolina, late in the war. And here's how it goes. In the Battle of Honey Hill, we had some poor ammunition, and the chief of artillery had it condemned. But the next morning, the rebels came down in the fog and opened on us. We promptly met them and soon silenced their fire, using of necessity the condemned ammunition. The chief of artillery came up and coolly said, "Well, Captain Hamner, you were trying to get rid of your poor ammunition." To this, the captain, who was one of the coolest, driest, bravest men that ever was, promptly answered with a tone and look altogether inimitable, but full of significance. "Yes, we are trying to get rid of the ammunition and trying to get rid of the rebels too." Afterwards, to get rid of the rebels was a current phrase with us. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.